She spoke, the Alpha King whispered, his voice breaking so softly that only the trembling servants nearest to him heard it. 5 years. 5 years of silence, of sleepless nights, of doctors shaking their heads and healers quietly admitting defeat. And now, in the middle of a candlelit banquet hall filled with nobles too stunned to breathe, his daughter stood on trembling little legs, her tiny hand lifted toward the one person no one thought belonged there. "Mommy," Rosie said again, her small voice shaky, uncertain, like she wasn't sure the word was real. Her finger remained pointed straight at the Omega standing frozen beside the banquet doors. Evelyn Hart forgot how to breathe. Somewhere nearby, silverware slipped from trembling hands and clattered onto polished stone, the sound startling against the crushing silence that had swallowed the hall whole. The future Luna candidate sitting beside the king went pale. The nobles stopped whispering. Even the musicians had lowered their instruments without realizing it. No one moved. No one dared. Because Princess Rosalie Vale had never spoken a single word in her entire life. Not after the fever. Not after the queen died. Not after years of specialists traveled from 3 different territories with promises too expensive to count and hope too fragile to survive. The princess had remained quiet through all of it, trapped inside a silence so deep even her own father no longer remembered the sound of her laughter. Yet somehow, impossibly, tonight she had spoken. And worse for the people who suddenly felt their perfect little world beginning to crack beneath them, she had spoken for the Omega. The rejected one. The disposable one. The girl no one had wanted near royal blood in the first place. Evelyn swallowed hard, fingers tightening around the tray she still held against her chest as though it might somehow shield her from the hundreds of eyes suddenly fixed on her. 3 weeks earlier, she had been sleeping in a one-room apartment above a struggling bakery in the outskirts of Ashwood, counting quarters to pay rent after the pact that once promised to protect her decided she had become inconvenient. Rejected Omegas didn't receive sympathy where she came from. They received pity if they were lucky, silence if they weren't. Mostly they became invisible. Evelyn had gotten good at invisible. Good at lowering her head. Good at pretending harsh words didn't sting as much as they did. Good at surviving disappointment in quiet ways no one noticed. Which was why the letter had felt ridiculous when it first arrived. A position at the royal estate. Temporary caretaker assignment. Hazard pay included. Applicants rarely lasted longer than a week. She had almost laughed when she read it, standing beside her tiny kitchen sink while rain tapped against the cracked window like impatient fingers. Who willingly took a job no one survived emotionally. But rent was due in 6 days. Her savings barely stretched far enough to buy groceries. And desperation had a way of making impossible things feel reasonable. The royal messenger had arrived before dawn the next morning. "His Majesty requires discretion," the woman had said flatly while handing over travel papers. "The princess has unique needs." Unique. Evelyn had learned very quickly that royal language often meant difficult. She just hadn't realized how lonely difficult could look until she first stepped into Blackthorn Palace and saw the little girl sitting completely alone beneath a giant window, snow falling outside in slow quiet sheets while untouched toys surrounded her like forgotten promises. Rosie hadn't looked up, hadn't smiled, hadn't spoken. She had simply stared out the glass like someone waiting for a world that never came back. "She has bitten 7 caretakers," the housekeeper said without looking at Evelyn once. 3 cried. 4 quit. 1 lasted 12 hours. The woman pushed open the towering oak doors with the sort of strength that came from years of surviving impossible employers. "Congratulations," she added dryly. "You are number 8. Evelyn tightened her grip on the single suitcase beside her leg as cold air spilled from the room beyond. Blackthorn Palace looked exactly like the kind of place people whispered about in towns where roofs leaked and bills stacked faster than hope. Everything inside seemed too large, too expensive, too polished to belong to ordinary people. Chandeliers hung like frozen stars above marble floors so clean she almost felt guilty walking across them. Portraits of kings lined endless hallways, their painted silver eyes somehow following her every step. Outside, snow drifted against towering windows in soft white sheets, covering the distant forest that wrapped around the palace like something ancient and watchful. Evelyn had never seen a place this beautiful before. Somehow it only made her feel smaller. "I am Miriam," the housekeeper said finally, not slowing as she moved through the corridor. "I oversee palace operations. which unfortunately includes the princess refusing to cooperate with nearly every living person. Evelyn hurried to keep up. What exactly happened to her? Miriam hesitated for half a second, long enough to suggest the answer carried weight. The queen passed away 4 years ago. Her voice softened just slightly. Afterward, Princess Rosalie stopped speaking. Evelyn swallowed. 4 years. A little girl carrying grief longer than most adults survived it. Doctors? She asked quietly. Every specialist money can buy, Miriam replied. Speech therapists, child psychologists, healers from 3 territories, tutors, spiritual advisors. Nothing worked. Her tone hardened again. The king stopped expecting miracles a long time ago. They turned another corner, and the hallway shifted from intimidating grandeur to something quieter, softer, smaller paintings, tiny coats hanging by a doorway, a forgotten stuffed rabbit sitting on a bench with one ear folded over. Signs of a child left untouched, as if the palace itself had learned to tiptoe around sadness. Miriam stopped outside a pair of pale blue doors. You will not force interaction, she said firmly. You will not raise your voice. You will not pressure her to speak. Evelyn nodded immediately. I would never. Miriam finally looked at her properly then, sharp gray eyes flicking over Evelyn's plain coat, inexpensive shoes and tired expression. Something unreadable passed across her face. Most people come here trying to fix the princess, she said. The last caretaker spent 3 days bribing her with candy and puppets. A pause. Rosie hid in a closet. Evelyn looked toward the door. What does she like? The question seemed to catch Miriam off guard. What? Not treatment plans, Evelyn said quietly. What does she like? For the first time since meeting her, the older woman blinked in surprise. Books, she admitted after a moment. Snow. Warm tea, though she pretends she does not. Drawing sometimes. Her expression tightened. And sitting by the east window for hours. Waiting, Evelyn thought before she could stop herself. Waiting for someone who never came home. Before she realized what she was doing, her hand moved toward the door handle. One thing, Miriam said suddenly. His Majesty will be watching. Evelyn froze. Watching. Miriam folded her hands neatly in front of her. King Lucian trusts almost no one near his daughter. Her voice lowered. You may not always see him, but he sees everything. Somewhere deeper inside the palace, a clock chimed the hour. Evelyn suddenly became very aware of how loud her heartbeat sounded. She had taken this job because rent was due, because survival did not leave room for pride, because invisible girls did not get choices. But standing there outside that door, something shifted quietly inside her chest. Not fear exactly. Something gentler. Sadder. Because behind that door was not a princess. Not really. Just a little girl sitting alone with grief far too large for someone so small. Evelyn reached for the handle anyway. The room smelled faintly like vanilla tea and winter pine, warm in a way the rest of Blackthorn Palace was not. Evelyn stepped inside carefully, letting the heavy door close behind her with barely a sound. For a moment nothing moved. Sunlight spilled through towering windows, turning drifting snow outside into silver flecks of light. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, stuffed unevenly with picture books, worn fairy tales and untouched puzzles gathering quiet dust. Tiny blankets had been folded over chairs. Crayons sat abandoned beside a half-finished drawing on a low wooden table. It looked less like a princess's room and more like a place grief had slowly forgotten how to leave. And there, beneath the east window, sat Rosie. She looked smaller than Evelyn expected. 5 years old, maybe, but carrying herself with the stillness of someone much older. Her pale blonde curls rested against a blue sweater several sizes too big, sleeves hanging over tiny hands. One sock had slipped halfway down her ankle, forgotten. She sat cross-legged beside the window seat, staring into the snow like she had memorized every flake that ever touched the glass. She did not turn around, did not blink, did not react at all. Evelyn waited a moment, uncertain. The silence felt different here. Heavy but not cold, like something fragile sleeping beneath the surface. Hi, Evelyn said softly after a while. I am Evelyn. Nothing. No movement. No acknowledgement. Somewhere in the distance, wind brushed softly against the old castle walls. Evelyn looked around the room again before carefully setting her suitcase near the door. Every instinct told her to fill the silence somehow, to ask questions, to smile bigger, to try harder. But another instinct, quieter and older, whispered something else. Sit first. So she did. Slowly, carefully, she lowered herself onto the rug nearly 6 feet away, leaving space between them. Rosie remained completely still. Evelyn crossed her legs and glanced toward the drawing left on the table. A crooked house. Snow falling outside. 3 stick figures standing together beneath a giant moon. One had been scribbled over so heavily the paper nearly tore. Something tightened quietly in her chest. You know, Evelyn said after another minute, keeping her voice soft enough to belong to the room instead of interrupting it. When I was little, snow made me nervous. Still nothing. Everybody else loved it, she continued. But I hated how quiet everything felt after. She smiled faintly to herself. Like the whole world forgot how to breathe. Rosie's fingers twitched against the edge of her sweater. So small Evelyn almost missed it. Encouraged, she looked toward the snow outside too. Where I grew up, we only got maybe 6 inches every winter, she said. Sometimes less. Enough for snow angels if you were lucky. She paused. Do you like snow? Silence again. But this time Rosie blinked. Slow. Deliberate. Evelyn pretended not to notice. The room settled around them, strangely peaceful despite everything she had heard downstairs. No screaming. No throwing things. No angry tears. Just quiet. Maybe loneliness recognized loneliness, she thought suddenly. Maybe hurt had a way of finding itself in other people. Minutes slipped by. 10 maybe. 15. Evelyn eventually leaned back against the side of the couch, exhaustion creeping into her shoulders after the long drive. You do not have to talk to me, she said gently. I just figured maybe you did not want to be alone. For the first time since entering the room, Rosie turned her head. Just slightly. Barely enough for Evelyn to catch sight of wide blue eyes watching her from beneath soft curls. Curious. Careful. Quiet. Then, before Evelyn could say another word, Rosie slowly reached toward the tea tray beside the window, lifted a second untouched cup with tiny hands, and placed it carefully on the empty space between them. The tiny porcelain cup sat between them like an offering too fragile to touch. Evelyn stared at it for half a second, surprised enough that warmth spread unexpectedly through her chest. Not because it was tea, not because of the gesture itself, but because something about the careful way Rosie had placed it there felt intentional. Quiet but intentional. Like a door opening 1 inch after years of staying locked. Evelyn looked toward the little girl carefully. For me, she asked softly. Rosie did not answer. Her attention had already drifted back toward the snow outside, shoulders small beneath the oversized sweater. But she had not moved the cup away either. Evelyn hesitated only a moment before reaching for it. The tea had gone lukewarm, faintly sweet with vanilla and honey. Thank you, she said anyway. This might be the nicest welcome I have gotten in months. A tiny movement. Barely visible. Rosie's fingers curled tighter around the edge of the window seat, like she had heard every word and was pretending not to care. Evelyn smiled to herself. You know, she said quietly after another sip. Where I grew up, there was this bakery downstairs from my apartment. Every winter, they made cinnamon rolls the size of dinner plates. She held her hands out dramatically. Seriously. Huge. Nothing. But after a moment Rosie's eyes shifted toward her. Just briefly. Curious. Evelyn pretended not to notice again. The baker used to burn every first batch, she continued. Every single morning. He blamed the oven. But honestly, I think he just liked complaining. Another pause. Do you ever get tired of palace food? This time Rosie blinked twice, slow and thoughtful, before lowering her eyes. Not a yes. Not a no. But not nothing either. Evelyn recognized the feeling immediately. Sometimes people stopped talking because words felt unsafe. Sometimes silence became armor. And armor did not disappear just because someone asked nicely. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the quiet changed. A knock sounded softly at the door before Miriam stepped inside carrying folded linens. She stopped so abruptly that one blanket nearly slipped from her hands. Her sharp eyes moved immediately between Evelyn, sitting calmly on the floor, and Rosie, who had not hidden under furniture, thrown anything, or burst into tears like apparently everyone expected. Then Miriam noticed the empty second teacup. Something unreadable flickered across her face. "Lunch in 40 minutes, she said carefully, voice unusually subdued. Rosie turned her face away instantly, retreating back toward the window. The shift was immediate. Withdrawal. Distance. Fear maybe. Miriam sighed quietly. "She never eats downstairs," she admitted once Rosie looked away again. "The dining hall overwhelms her." Evelyn glanced at the little girl. "Could I bring food up here?" Miriam looked surprised. "Most caretakers insist she learn routine." "Maybe," Evelyn said gently. "Routine comes after trust." Silence stretched for a moment. Miriam studied her carefully, like she was trying to figure out what game Evelyn might be playing. But Evelyn had never been particularly good at games. She only knew what loneliness looked like when it stopped asking for help. "I will see what the kitchen can do," Miriam said finally before leaving the room quieter than she entered. The moment the door clicked shut again, Rosie relaxed just slightly. Evelyn noticed immediately. "Not a fan of grown-ups telling you what to do?" she asked softly. For the first time all morning, something happened that nearly stole the breath from her chest. Rosie rolled her eyes. Tiny. Dramatic. Completely serious. Evelyn covered her mouth before a laugh escaped too loudly. "Oh," she whispered, grinning despite herself. "You are funny." Rosie looked startled by the reaction, blue eyes widening slightly. Then, slowly, carefully, like sunshine trying to remember how to exist after winter, the corner of her mouth lifted just enough to almost become a smile. Neither of them noticed the shadow standing quietly beyond the half-open doorway. Tall. Silent. Silver-eyed. Watching everything. King Lucianvale had learned a long time ago that hope was dangerous. Hope made promises reality never kept. Hope looked like expensive specialists arriving at Blackthorn Palace carrying leather briefcases and polished smiles, swearing they understood childhood grief before quietly leaving 2 weeks later with sympathy in their eyes and failure folded neatly into professional language. Hope looked like his daughter sitting silent at the edge of every room afterward, smaller somehow each time someone gave up on her. So when Miriam knocked softly against the study door that afternoon and said, "You should see this," he almost refused to look. The king stood near the massive windows overlooking the frozen cliffs surrounding Blackthorn Palace, one hand resting against the desk as reports sat untouched beneath his fingertips. Trade disputes, territory negotiations, border complaints, problems he usually solved without hesitation. But today his focus had drifted every few minutes toward the East Wing, toward a room he had trained himself not to expect miracles from anymore. "Another incident?" he asked quietly, exhaustion sitting heavy beneath his voice. Miriam hesitated. "No, Your Majesty." Something strange softened her expression. "That is exactly the problem." Lucian frowned. 10 minutes later, he stood unseen in the hallway outside Rosie's room, broad shoulders still beneath a dark wool coat dusted faintly with snow from earlier patrol inspections. The palace had gone unusually quiet around him. Servants whispered less when the king passed, mostly because silence followed him naturally these days. The moment his wife died, something cold settled inside him and never entirely left. He looked through the narrow opening in the door and stopped moving completely. Rosie sat at the low table near the fireplace instead of beside the window. That alone almost startled him. Usually she remained there for hours, staring outside as though waiting for winter itself to answer her loneliness. But now crayons covered the table. Sheets of paper scattered everywhere. And sitting beside her, sleeves rolled up awkwardly, was the Omega. Evelyn Hart. She had somehow managed to get marker ink on her fingers. "Okay," Evelyn said dramatically, holding up a badly drawn wolf with very crooked legs. "I know this looks terrible, but in my defense, I was emotionally unprepared for how difficult drawing ears would be." Rosie stared at the paper, completely serious for 3 seconds. Then slowly her shoulders moved. Tiny at first. A quiet shake. Lucian blinked once. Then twice. Was she laughing? No sound came. But there it was again. The slightest lift in her cheeks. The beginning of joy trying to remember itself. Something unfamiliar tightened painfully inside his chest. He had not seen that expression in years. Evelyn held up another drawing, somehow worse than the first. This one looks like the wolf gave up on life, she admitted solemnly. Honestly, I think he needs emotional support. Rosie reached for the crayon. Small fingers carefully corrected one ear before sliding the paper back. A silent offering. A collaboration. Lucian stood completely still. Rosie did not sit near strangers. Did not participate. Did not trust. And yet there she was, sharing space with someone she had met less than a day ago. Miriam stepped beside him quietly. She ate lunch, she whispered. Lucian did not look away from the room. How much? Almost everything. Another pause. And she requested tea. Requested. Such a small word. Such a devastating thing after years of silence filled with gestures and shrinking away from the world. Inside the room, Evelyn stretched her legs out dramatically and sighed. I should warn you, she said to Rosie quietly. I am terrible at royal stuff. Rosie looked up. Like really terrible. Evelyn lowered her voice like she was confessing state secrets. I almost waved at a statue downstairs because I thought it was a person. Rosie pressed both hands against her mouth suddenly, blue eyes wide with startled amusement. And then it happened again. That tiny almost smile. Small enough most people would miss it. But not him. Never him. Lucian felt something dangerous move quietly beneath years of grief. Hope. He hated how quickly it arrived. She is eating breakfast downstairs tomorrow. The announcement landed over dinner like a stone dropped into perfectly still water. Forks paused halfway to plates. Conversations softened. Even the fire crackling against the enormous dining hall walls somehow sounded quieter afterward. Evelyn nearly dropped the spoon in her hand. Across from her, Miriam calmly buttered a dinner roll like she had not just said something impossible. Downstairs. Evelyn repeated carefully. With everyone? Miriam nodded once. The king requested it. Requested sounded suspiciously close to ordered in a palace this large. Evelyn glanced instinctively toward Rosie, who sat beside her at the smaller breakfast table tucked near the window alcove. The little girl had spent most of dinner quietly arranging peas into tiny circles while occasionally glancing at Evelyn to make sure she was still there. At the word downstairs, Rosie's shoulders stiffened. Small fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. The change was immediate. Tiny but impossible to miss once you noticed it. Fear did not always scream. Sometimes it simply went still. Evelyn lowered her voice gently. Hey, she said softly, leaning just slightly closer. We do not have to decide tonight. Rosie kept staring at her plate. Miriam sighed quietly. His Majesty believes exposure may help. Evelyn bit back her first response. Because exposure sounded suspiciously like pressure, and pressure had clearly not worked for years. Maybe, Evelyn said carefully. Or maybe breakfast with 30 adults staring at her sounds terrifying. Before Miriam could answer, movement at the doorway shifted the room entirely. Conversations stopped. Servants straightened. Something invisible seemed to pull tighter in the air itself. King Lucian entered without ceremony. Dark wool coat folded over one arm as snow melted quietly from his boots. Tall. Quiet. Silver-eyed. He carried authority the way storms carried thunder. Effortlessly. Evelyn immediately looked down toward her plate, suddenly aware of the fact she had accidentally called a royal statue handsome in front of Rosie 3 hours ago. Loudly. Repeatedly. Rosie noticed him instantly. Her body went still in an entirely different way this time. Not fear exactly. Distance. Familiar distance. Lucian's expression softened almost invisibly when his gaze landed on his daughter. Rosie, he said quietly. She looked down. Evelyn felt something ache unexpectedly in her chest. The king crossed the room slower than she expected, pulling out the chair beside Rosie instead of sitting at the head of the massive table prepared for him. A small thing, but somehow heartbreaking. Like someone trying to be invited into a space they no longer knew how to enter. How was today? He asked softly. Rosie traced circles against the table with one fingertip. No answer. The silence settled again. Familiar. Heavy. Lucian nodded once like he had expected nothing else and accepted it anyway. Something about that hurt to watch. Because disappointment lived quietly inside people after long enough. Evelyn noticed Rosie glance sideways at her. Just once. nervous, unsure, like she wanted something but could not ask for it. So Evelyn took a careful breath. "We drew wolves today," she offered lightly into the silence. Mine looked emotionally exhausted. To her complete surprise, Lucian blinked. Then one corner of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly. "That sounds concerning," he said dryly. Evelyn nearly forgot he was terrifying for half a second. "Honestly," she admitted, "the wolf looked like he had taxes." A tiny sound escaped Rosie. Not quite laughter. More like air trying very hard to become happiness. Lucian froze completely. His eyes shifted slowly toward his daughter. Rosie looked startled by the sound herself, quickly lowering her head again. But it was too late. The moment had happened. Something fragile. Something alive. Lucian looked toward Evelyn then, really looked at her for the first time. Not like staff. Not temporary help. Not disposable. His silver gaze lingered for half a second too long, unreadable and careful all at once. "Breakfast," he said finally, voice quieter now, "can wait." And for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Palace, Evelyn thought maybe the king was not cold at all. Maybe he was simply afraid to hope too loudly. By the end of the first week, the palace had started whispering. Palaces, Evelyn learned quickly, were excellent at whispering. Servants whispered while polishing silver trays. Guards whispered near stairwells when they thought no one important stood close enough to hear. Even cooks whispered while pretending to focus very hard on chopping vegetables. Because something impossible had begun happening in Blackthorn Palace. Princess Rosalie Vale had stopped hiding. It started with breakfast. Not downstairs in the grand dining hall where chandeliers sparkled like judgment, and too many eyes waited for disappointment. No. Rosie still refused that. But she had started eating in the small sunroom overlooking the eastern gardens instead of alone by the window upstairs. Evelyn usually sat nearby pretending not to notice whenever Rosie quietly pushed half her toast toward her plate like sharing food, somehow felt safer than sharing feelings. Then came books. Rosie had always loved stories, Miriam explained one afternoon while pretending she was not smiling at all. But after the Queen passed, she stopped letting anyone read to her. The books remained untouched for years, collecting dust faster than memories healed. Yet somehow, Evelyn found herself sitting cross-legged on the nursery rug, every evening reading terrible dragon stories in dramatically exaggerated voices, while Rosie sat wrapped in blankets nearby pretending she absolutely was not entertained. The dragon looked deeply inconvenienced. Evelyn read one night, lowering her voice dramatically. Like somebody interrupted his emotional healing journey. Rosie pressed her lips together hard, shoulders shaking suspiciously beneath the blanket. "I know," Evelyn whispered in mock seriousness. "He sounds exhausting." Somewhere near the doorway, someone quietly snorted. Evelyn looked up to find Miriam standing there holding fresh linens, very obviously trying not to laugh. "You are corrupting royal literature," the older woman said dryly. "I am improving it," Evelyn corrected. "Important difference." Beside her, Rosie leaned slightly against Evelyn's shoulder without seeming to realize she had done it. The moment lasted maybe 3 seconds before the little girl straightened immediately, cheeks faintly pink. But Evelyn noticed. More importantly, someone else noticed too. King Lucian had developed an alarming habit of appearing unexpectedly, never interrupting, never announcing himself, just standing quietly near doorways, silver eyes watchful beneath that constant impossible stillness he wore like armor. Sometimes he stood there for 5 minutes, sometimes longer. Evelyn never quite knew what to do with his presence, because he looked at Rosie like someone holding his breath underwater, terrified to move too quickly and lose everything again. But lately he had started looking at Evelyn differently too. Not warmly exactly, more carefully, like he was trying to understand a language he forgot how to speak. The problem came with everyone else. "You seem comfortable," Lady Beatrice Holloway remarked one afternoon, voice sweet in the way expensive perfume could sometimes smell rotten underneath. Evelyn nearly dropped the basket of books she carried. Lady Beatrice stood near the staircase wrapped in pale ivory silk, elegant enough to belong in paintings and sharp enough to make people nervous. Rumor said she had been spending increasing amounts of time at Blackthorn Palace lately. Rumor also said half the kingdom expected her to become queen someday. "I am only helping the princess," Evelyn answered quietly. Of course, Beatrice said with a polished smile that never touched her eyes. Though people are beginning to talk. Evelyn looked down instinctively. About what? Beatrice tilted her head. About a rejected Omega suddenly becoming very important. The words landed softer than cruelty but heavier than kindness. A reminder. Of place. Of status. Of how quickly invisible people were expected to stay invisible. Before Evelyn could answer, tiny footsteps echoed from the hallway. Rosie appeared holding a picture book against her chest. The moment she spotted Evelyn, she crossed the distance immediately and stopped beside her. Close enough their sleeves brushed. Beatrice's smile faltered for exactly 1 second. Rosie looked up at Evelyn expectantly, then toward the book in her hands. Waiting. Choosing. And for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Palace, Evelyn realized something dangerous had quietly begun happening. Rosie trusted her. You are becoming a problem, Lady Beatrice said softly enough that anyone walking past might mistake the words for concern. Snow drifted lazily beyond the palace windows, bright against the gray afternoon sky, while servants hurried through the hallway pretending not to notice tension settling into the air like invisible frost. Evelyn stood frozen beside the bookshelf she had been organizing, fingers still wrapped around a stack of dragon stories Rosie insisted belonged in a very specific order only she seemed to understand. I am sorry? Evelyn asked quietly, uncertain she had heard correctly. Beatrice smiled again. Perfect. Polished. Cold around the edges. You are making people uncomfortable. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the nursery doors down the hall where Rosie sat inside coloring near the fireplace. The princess is attached. The word carried strange weight. Too sharp to be kind. Evelyn lowered the book slowly. I only spend time with her. Exactly. Beatrice stepped closer, perfume soft and expensive, voice dropping lower. You are temporary staff, Miss Hart. Yet somehow the king's daughter now waits for you every morning. Refuses meals without you nearby. Cries when you leave a room. Evelyn swallowed hard. She had not realized people noticed. Or maybe she had noticed and simply hoped no one cared enough to turn kindness into suspicion. Rosie is just adjusting, Evelyn said carefully. Children need stability. Something flickered in Beatrice's expression then. Irritation maybe. You should be careful, she said sweetly. Palaces are not kind to girls who forget their place. Before Evelyn could answer, movement near the nursery doorway pulled both their attention. Rosie stood there clutching her picture book tightly against her chest. Blue eyes fixed immediately on Evelyn. The moment Beatrice stepped even slightly closer, Rosie hesitated. Small shoulders stiffening. Evelyn felt the shift instantly. Fear again. Quiet fear. Not loud enough to demand attention. Just enough to hurt. So Evelyn crouched carefully, softening her voice. Hey, she said gently. Everything okay? Rosie looked toward Beatrice, then back at Evelyn. Slowly, deliberately, she crossed the hallway and stood directly beside her. Close enough their sleeves brushed again. Tiny fingers reached carefully for the edge of Evelyn's cardigan and held on. The hallway went strangely quiet. Beatrice's smile thinned almost invisibly. Interesting, she murmured. Evelyn ignored the comment completely. Did you finish the castle drawing? She asked Rosie instead. Rosie nodded once, still gripping Evelyn's sweater like letting go might somehow make her disappear. Can I see? Rosie hesitated before holding up the picture. A giant castle covered in snow. One small girl near the window. One tall figure beside her drawn in crooked crayon lines with absurdly yellow hair that looked nothing like Evelyn's actual dark blonde. Above them, badly written but unmistakable, sat one word in shaky uneven letters. Friend. Something tightened painfully in Evelyn's chest. Rosie, she whispered softly. This is beautiful. Rosie ducked her head instantly, cheeks pink. Behind them, Beatrice exhaled quietly through her nose. How touching, she said. But her voice had changed. Colder now. Sharper somehow. Though children become confused very easily. Evelyn stood slowly. I do not think kindness confuses people. For the first time, Beatrice's pleasant expression cracked. Just slightly. No, she said softly. But dependency does. Then she turned and walked away, heels clicking sharply against marble floors. The moment she disappeared around the corner, Rosie's grip tightened. Evelyn looked down. "Hey," she said quietly. "You are okay." Rosie still looked toward the hallway, uneasy. Then something unexpected happened. Tiny fingers reached slowly upward and tugged lightly against Evelyn's sleeve. Toward the nursery. Like she was asking her not to leave. Evelyn smiled despite herself. "Okay," she whispered. "I am coming." Neither of them noticed the silver-eyed king standing silently at the end of the hall, having heard far more of the conversation than anyone realized. And for the first time in years, something dangerously close to anger stirred beneath his carefully controlled calm. The invitation arrived folded in silver paper thick enough to feel expensive. Evelyn stared at it for nearly 30 seconds before deciding there had to be some mistake. Royal Winter Banquet. Attendance requested. Formal attire required. She turned the card over twice as if hidden instructions might suddenly appear explaining why someone like her had been invited to stand inside a room full of people who probably spent more on shoes than she made in 6 months. "You are attending," Miriam confirmed later that afternoon while adjusting folded linens near the nursery fireplace. Her tone carried the dangerous certainty of someone who had already decided arguing would accomplish nothing. The king requested it personally. Evelyn nearly dropped the tea tray in her hands. "Requested," she repeated weakly. Miriam lifted one brow. "You have become important to the princess." There it was again. That strange, uncomfortable sentence nobody seemed ready to say out loud properly. Important. As though the word itself made everyone uneasy. Across the room, Rosie sat cross-legged on the rug surrounded by crayons, listening without pretending not to. The moment she heard banquet, her little shoulders tightened immediately. Evelyn noticed. She always noticed now. "I do not think she likes the idea," Evelyn said quietly. Rosie lowered her gaze to the floor. Miriam sighed. Lady Beatrice insisted the princess should begin public appearances again. Of course she did. Something about that made unease settle quietly into Evelyn's stomach. And if Rosie does not want to? Miriam hesitated. Palaces are complicated. Which sounded suspiciously like no one planned to ask the child what she wanted. That evening, a garment bag arrived at Evelyn's room. Inside waited the prettiest dress she had ever touched. Deep midnight blue. Long sleeves. Soft fabric that shimmered faintly when candlelight caught the folds. Elegant without trying too hard. Impossible for someone like her to own. A handwritten note rested carefully inside the box. For the banquet. Princess approved. No signature. But when Evelyn looked up later, Rosie sat proudly near the nursery window pretending very hard not to smile. "You picked this?" Evelyn asked softly. Rosie nodded once. "Tiny. Careful." "It is beautiful," Evelyn whispered honestly. "Thank you." Rosie looked pleased for exactly 3 seconds before remembering she preferred pretending not to care. The banquet arrived faster than Evelyn expected. Blackthorn Palace transformed overnight into something impossibly grand. Crystal chandeliers glowed warm against towering ceilings, while musicians played soft-string music near the enormous staircase. Guests arrived wrapped in velvet and diamonds, laughter floating too easily through rooms filled with expensive perfume and polished confidence. Evelyn suddenly missed her tiny apartment above the bakery with embarrassing intensity. At least there nobody expected her to belong. "Stay close," Miriam warned quietly before disappearing into palace duties. Evelyn glanced toward Rosie, who stood beside her in a pale silver dress, small fingers already gripping the fabric of Evelyn's sleeve beneath the table. Nervous. Overwhelmed. "We can leave if it gets too much," Evelyn whispered. Rosie looked up immediately. Hope flickered briefly across her face. Then voices interrupted them. "Well," Lady Beatrice said smoothly as she approached surrounded by perfectly dressed noblewomen. "How sweet." Her eyes drifted deliberately between Evelyn and Rosie. "The princess seems very attached." One of the women beside her smiled too politely. "Children do become confused so easily." Another added softly, "Especially after loss." Evelyn felt heat crawl uncomfortably up her neck. Rosie's grip tightened. Beatrice tilted her head just enough to wound without seeming cruel. "Though perhaps," she said sweetly, "encouraging dependency from someone temporary is unwise." The words landed harder this time because people were watching. Listening. Judging. Evelyn swallowed quietly. I would never hurt Rosie, she said softly. Beatrice's smile sharpened. No, she murmured. But leaving eventually might. Silence stretched. Around them conversations softened. Attention shifted. Evelyn suddenly felt very visible in the worst possible way. Then Beatrice glanced toward a palace attendant nearby. Actually, she said lightly, perhaps staff should wait near the rear tables. Staff. Not guest. Not invited. Just reminder. Of place. Of status. Of exactly who belonged near royalty and who did not. Beside her, Rosie suddenly went very still. The room did not go silent all at once. Silence arrived slowly, like snowfall settling over something already fragile. Conversations thinned. Crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. Somewhere across the ballroom, musicians faltered for half a second before awkwardly continuing as if expensive people pretending not to witness cruelty somehow made it disappear. Evelyn felt every eye without needing to look up. That old familiar feeling returned instantly. The one she thought she had left behind when she came to Blackthorn Palace. Small. Out of place. Temporary. She lowered her gaze carefully, fingers tightening around the edge of her dress. Rosie still stood beside her, tiny hand gripping her sleeve so tightly little wrinkles had formed in the fabric. Evelyn could feel the trembling now. Small. Nervous. Overwhelmed. It is okay, Evelyn whispered softly, crouching just enough so her voice belonged only to Rosie. You do not have to stay. Rosie did not move. Her blue eyes stayed fixed somewhere near the floor, shoulders pulled tight beneath silver fabric. Around them, nobles exchanged glances dressed as concern. Lady Beatrice folded her hands neatly. Elegant. Calm. Victorious. Perhaps, she said sweetly enough to sting, Princess Rosalie would feel more comfortable near family. Family. The word landed strangely, like something Rosie no longer trusted. Evelyn forced a small smile she did not feel. I think Rosie just needs quiet, she said gently. I can take her upstairs. Beatrice tilted her head. How thoughtful. A pause. Then quieter. Sharper. Though I imagine separation will be difficult for her eventually. Evelyn swallowed hard. Because this part hurt precisely where old wounds already lived. Leaving. Temporary. Disposable. Words rejected girls learn too early. Rosie deserved steadiness. Someone permanent. Someone who belonged in castles and royal photographs and futures large enough to survive winter. Not someone counting rent money above bakeries 6 weeks ago. Evelyn reached carefully for Rosie's hand. Come on, sweetheart, she whispered softly. Let us go somewhere quieter. Rosie did not move. Evelyn tried again gently. Rosie. The little girl suddenly stepped backward. Tiny fingers slipping from Evelyn's sleeve only to clutch tighter against the front of her own dress. Her breathing looked wrong now. Quick. Uneven. Panicked in the small silent way children sometimes broke apart when words failed them. Evelyn's chest tightened instantly. Hey, she whispered softly, kneeling completely now. You are okay. Behind them someone sighed impatiently. Another noble murmured something about overstimulation. Beatrice remained perfectly composed. You see, she said softly to no one and everyone, this attachment has become unhealthy. Rosie's lip trembled. Tiny shoulders shaking now. Evelyn forgot the room entirely. Sweetheart, she said quietly. Look at me. Slowly, uncertainly, Rosie lifted her face. Blue eyes bright with overwhelmed tears she clearly did not know what to do with. Evelyn smiled softly despite the ache in her chest. You do not have to be brave right now, she whispered. I am here. The ballroom seemed to pause. Rosie stared at her. 1 second. 2. 3. Somewhere near the entrance, King Lucian had finally arrived, silver eyes already narrowing at the tension thickening through the room. He had not yet reached them when it happened. Rosie stepped forward suddenly, tiny hands gripping the fabric of Evelyn's dress. Her little face scrunched tightly like she was fighting through something invisible and enormous. Then came the sound nobody in Blackthorn Palace had heard in 5 years. Small. Shaky. Fragile enough to almost disappear. The room froze completely. Lucian stopped walking. Rosie's breathing trembled harder. Tiny fingers clutching tighter. blue eyes locked only on Evelyn. Then, with all the terrifying effort of a child breaking through grief itself, she pointed upward with one trembling hand and whispered the word that shattered the entire ballroom in half. "Mommy!" The ballroom forgot how to breathe. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, untouched and elegant, while below them nearly 200 people stood frozen in absolute silence. No whispered gossip. No polite laughter. No music. Just one tiny trembling word still hanging impossibly in the air. "Mommy!" Evelyn could not move. Her knees remained bent where she had crouched beside Rosie, heart beating so hard it almost hurt. Surely she had imagined it. Surely grief and pressure and too many staring eyes had twisted something inside her head. But Rosie still stood there clutching the front of Evelyn's dress with tiny shaking hands, blue eyes impossibly wide, chest rising unevenly like she had climbed some invisible mountain just to get the sound out. "Mommy," she whispered again, quieter this time, uncertain now, like she was afraid the word might disappear if nobody caught it fast enough. Something inside Evelyn shattered softly. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered before she could stop herself, voice trembling around emotions too large to name. Across the ballroom, someone quietly gasped. Another person dropped a fork onto polished marble. The sharp sound echoed embarrassingly loud through the silence. Lady Beatrice had gone completely still. Perfect posture. Perfect composure. But the color had drained from her face so quickly even strangers noticed. Near the entrance, King Lucian looked less like royalty and more like a man suddenly forgetting how to stand. He had stopped moving entirely the moment the first sound left Rosie's lips. Silver eyes wide with something dangerously close to heartbreak. Hope. Fear. Disbelief. Maybe all three. For 5 years he had waded through silence thick enough to drown inside. 5 birthdays. 5 winters. 5 years of unanswered questions and quiet grief wrapped around tiny shoulders too small to carry it. And now, impossibly, his daughter had spoken. He crossed the ballroom slowly at first, then faster. Guests moved out of the way without needing instruction. Nobody breathed loud enough to interrupt the moment. Lucian stopped just beside them, kneeling so quickly the expensive fabric of his coat brushed the floor unnoticed. For 1 second he only looked at Rosie, really looked at her, like he was afraid blinking might wake him from whatever impossible dream this was. "Rosie," he said quietly, voice rough around the edges in a way Evelyn had never heard before. "Little wolf." His hand trembled slightly before settling carefully against the edge of her sleeve, like even now he feared frightening her away. Rosie looked toward him briefly, then back at Evelyn, tiny fingers tightening again. "Mommy," she whispered once more. This time stronger, clearer, pointing again directly at Evelyn like there had never been another answer in the world. Something broke across Lucian's face then. Not dramatic, not loud, just quiet devastation wrapped around wonder too fragile to survive disbelief. He lowered his head briefly like he needed 1 second to steady himself against something bigger than pride. When he finally looked up, his silver eyes were shining in a way that made Evelyn's chest ache unexpectedly. "She spoke," he whispered softly, almost to himself, like saying it out loud might make it real. Miriam stood near the back of the ballroom openly crying without bothering to hide it anymore. Several servants wiped tears quietly. Even guests who spent their lives pretending emotions were inconvenient looked shaken. Because everyone in Blackthorn Palace knew the story of the Silent Princess. Everyone knew what this moment meant. Rosie stepped closer suddenly and leaned against Evelyn's shoulder, still small and overwhelmed, tiny body trembling with exhaustion after something so enormous. Instinct moved faster than thought. Evelyn gently wrapped one arm around her. Careful. Protective. Familiar. Lucian watched the gesture silently, something unreadable shifting quietly behind his eyes. Not suspicion anymore. Not caution. Something softer. Something frighteningly close to gratitude. Then, in a voice low enough to quiet the entire room all over again, he said the words nobody expected from a king. "Thank you," he whispered. The banquet never truly recovered after that. People tried, of course. Nobles always did. Someone quietly instructed the musicians to resume playing. Servants continued moving silver trays through the ballroom with careful professionalism. Conversations restarted in awkward fragments, softer now, hesitant around something too sacred to interrupt carelessly. But the room had changed. Because moments like that did not disappear. They lingered, settled into walls, rewrote things people thought they understood. Evelyn still knelt beside Rosie, pulse unsteady beneath her ribs, while the little girl leaned quietly against her shoulder like she had found something she had been missing for years without realizing she was searching. Rosie looked exhausted now. Small fingers curled sleepily into the fabric of Evelyn's dress, blue eyes blinking slower with every passing minute. Speaking had cost her something. You could see it, feel it. Lucian remained kneeling beside them too, one hand resting lightly against his daughter's back like reassurance had suddenly become something he could touch again. Every few seconds, his silver gaze drifted toward Rosie as though he still expected the moment to vanish if he looked away too long. Then his attention shifted slowly toward Evelyn. And stayed there. Not briefly this time. Not cautiously. Really stayed. Like he was seeing something entirely different than the Omega who arrived carrying one worn suitcase and too much sadness hidden behind polite smiles. Something softer settled quietly into his expression. Respect maybe. Gratitude certainly. But underneath it something else moved too. Something harder to name. Because for years people had entered Blackthorn Palace trying to fix Rosie. Doctors measured progress. Specialists chased outcomes. Tutors treated silence like failure. Everyone wanted results. Nobody seemed to understand loneliness. Except somehow, impossibly, Evelyn had walked in and simply stayed beside it until Rosie no longer felt alone inside it. She trusts you, Lucian said finally, voice low enough to belong only to them. Evelyn glanced down instinctively. I think she was just waiting for someone to listen, she answered softly. Rosie tightened her hold on Evelyn's sleeve as though agreeing. Something about that made Lucian look away briefly, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Regret lived there. Evelyn recognized it immediately. The quiet kind parents carried when grief convinced them survival mattered more than softness. I tried, he admitted after a moment, voice rough around the edges again. After her mother. He stopped. The unfinished sentence settled quietly between them. Rosie leaned closer against Evelyn. Lucian exhaled slowly through his nose. I did not know how to reach her anymore. The honesty startled her. Kings were not supposed to sound uncertain. They were supposed to look impossible. Untouchable. But kneeling there beside his daughter, Lucian suddenly looked painfully human. Just a father terrified he had lost too much already. You did not stop trying, Evelyn said gently. She knows that. For one quiet second, something vulnerable crossed his face so quickly she almost missed it. Then footsteps interrupted them. Lady Beatrice stood several feet away now, posture flawless but expression impossible to read. Around her, whispers had changed direction entirely. People no longer looked at Evelyn with amusement or dismissal. Something closer to curiosity now. Surprise. Respect in places where judgment had lived an hour earlier. Beatrice offered a polished smile that felt tighter than before. Quite the remarkable evening, she said carefully. Lucian stood slowly then, taller than everyone around him, presence shifting the room without effort. When he looked toward Beatrice, something colder settled quietly behind his silver eyes. Calm, controlled, final. Indeed, he said evenly. His hand rested briefly against Rosie's shoulder before his attention returned to Evelyn. Not staff. Not temporary. Not invisible. Miss Hart, he said quietly, though the room somehow still heard every word. Thank you for caring for my daughter when others stopped seeing her. Silence settled again. Different this time. Heavier. Meaningful. Because everybody understood what kings thanked publicly. And what they protected afterward. Rosie yawned softly against Evelyn's shoulder before lifting sleepy eyes upward, and reaching one tiny hand toward her again without hesitation. Asking her to stay. The palace felt different after that night. Softer somehow. Like even the old stone walls had stopped holding their breath. Snow continued falling outside Blackthorn Palace in slow silver sheets, blanketing the gardens in quiet white, while fireplaces crackled gently through long hallways that no longer seemed quite so cold. But the biggest difference arrived after midnight. She will not sleep, Miriam said with the exhausted patience of someone who had already tried everything twice. Evelyn blinked sleepily from the doorway of her small guest room. hair messy from half-finished rest and sweater sleeves hanging too long over her hands. What do you mean she will not sleep? Miriam sighed. I mean she refuses to remain in bed unless you are nearby. Somewhere down the hall came the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps followed by silence. Then softer footsteps. Waiting footsteps. Evelyn's chest tightened immediately. Oh no, she whispered, already moving. Rosie stood outside her room clutching a blanket, nearly dragging against the floor. Pale curls messy. Tiny face sleepy and stubborn all at once. The moment she saw Evelyn, her shoulders relaxed visibly. Like relief itself had walked into the hallway. Hey, Evelyn said softly, crouching down. What happened? Rosie shifted awkwardly before quietly holding up the blanket toward her. Invitation. Request. Please do not leave. Evelyn looked helplessly toward Miriam. I really do not think I should. You should, Miriam interrupted immediately. Because His Majesty has already failed 3 separate bedtime negotiations. As if summoned by the sentence itself, Lucian appeared at the end of the hallway. Dark shirt sleeves rolled slightly, silver eyes carrying the unmistakable exhaustion of a father running entirely on hope and stubbornness. He looked less like a king tonight and more like someone trying very hard not to lose something precious again. She asked for you, he said quietly. Rosie immediately moved closer to Evelyn at the sound of his voice, but did not retreat anymore. That alone felt miraculous somehow. Evelyn hesitated. I do not want to overstep. Lucian looked at his daughter standing there wrapped in sleepiness and determination before answering carefully. I think, he said softly, we stopped worrying about normal circumstances several miracles ago. 20 minutes later, Evelyn found herself sitting carefully against the headboard in Rosie's room, while the little girl slept curled beside her, tiny hands still loosely gripping the sleeve of Evelyn's sweater like even dreams needed reassurance now. The room glowed softly beneath warm lamplight. Snow tapped quietly against tall windows. Somewhere near the fireplace sat abandoned crayons beside crooked wolf drawings and unfinished tea. Home, something inside Evelyn thought suddenly before she pushed the feeling away too fast. Dangerous thought. Temporary people should not think words like home. The door opened quietly. Lucian stepped inside carrying a forgotten storybook before stopping completely at the sight before him. Rosie asleep. Peaceful. Resting closer to another person than she had in years. Evelyn looked up carefully. Sorry, she whispered. I think she just needed company. Lucian stayed quiet for a long moment. Silver eyes softer than she had ever seen them. No, he said eventually, voice low enough to belong only to sleeping rooms and tired people. I think she needed you. The words landed somewhere dangerous inside Evelyn's chest. She looked down quickly. She deserves someone permanent, she said quietly. Someone who belongs here. Lucian leaned lightly against the doorway, gaze never leaving either of them. Maybe, he said after a moment. Sometimes people belong somewhere long before they believe they do. Silence settled warmly between them. Not awkward. Just quiet. Honest. Then Rosie shifted in her sleep. Tiny hand reaching instinctively toward Evelyn again before whispering one sleepy half-word too soft to almost hear. Mama? Lucian closed his eyes briefly like the sound physically hurt and healed something at the same time. When he opened them again, his voice came quieter than before, almost careful. You were hired to help my daughter, he said softly. But somehow, he looked toward Rosie, then back at Evelyn. I think you may have saved both of us.